Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Renée Chandler, pronouns she, her. I'm the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Oglethorpe. And thank you for joining this afternoon for Understanding Implicit Bias, a faculty workshop. So my office is co-hosting this with the Office of the Provost. And so Kendra, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you all. Again, most of you know me, Dr. Kendra King Momon, Associate Provost here at Oglethorpe. Great to see you all today.
Thanks, Kendra. All right, well, I'm looking forward to the conversation this afternoon. I do want to just reiterate, at any point, if you have questions or if there's, something you'd like to say or interject, feel free to, raise your hand in the chat, come off mute to ask your question. You could write something in the chat, please don't feel like you have to wait until the end or wait until there's a lull or a stop in order to ask questions. So we look forward to the conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So is that visible to everyone? Can you give me a thumbs up? Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay. So this is our agenda for the afternoon in talking about implicit bias. We'll discuss first why it's important for us to understand what implicit bias is and how it operates. We'll look at defining implicit bias and looking at how it shows up in our everyday lives and in our work here at Oglethorpe. And then we'll talk about some effective strategies for faculty in dealing with implicit bias. And then we'll deal with some questions as well. So just to start off, to give you an idea of some of the resources that I use for information in this presentation here, this slide deck will be available in the O Drive through the Provost office. It'll also be available on the DEI website, so you'll be able to access this later on. But this is just some of the information that I'm using to present today's workshop. So first, in understanding why we should understand implicit bias, it's important for us to normalize equity work and engage in what I refer to as caring curiosity. And so, I recognize that many people come to conversations like this dealing with past experiences, dealing with their own assumptions, dealing with concerns about, coming into this space and the impact that it's going to have in talking about a topic that is, in many instances, very sensitive and can be uncomfortable. For individuals of color, we come into a conversation in this space, and individuals from underrepresented groups, we come into these spaces dealing with trauma from past experiences, dealing with ways in which we've been disappointed by colleagues, by students, by others in our lives who we don't feel like have been supportive peers. And then even for those who are members of dominant groups, come into these spaces feeling like there might be a target on you, right? That this is a space where you're going to be told what you're doing wrong, or the ways that you're not as inclusive as you think you should be. And really all of these things make it difficult for us to have the motivation that we need in order to be agents of change here on campus. And so it's important that we engage in what I refer to as caring curiosity. And this means that we don't allow judgment or fear or anxiety to drive our actions, but yet try to engage in a conversation in this space through respect and through honesty and through concern for other members of our community, so that we ensure that we're creating a welcoming and inclusive campus community. So it's important that we normalize these conversations. What we know about the effect of bias, we know that both explicit and implicit bias have a harmful impact on underrepresented groups and members of our community. And I think we do a better job of dealing with or being aware of explicit forms of bias, right? We have all kinds of systems in place that will deal with explicit forms of bias, but that isn't necessarily the case when it comes to implicit, right? And so those forms of bias that may be indirect, that are expressed indirectly, are just as harmful and just as hurtful as those that are more direct and that are conscious. And then lastly, you know, the importance of having this conversation is to recognize that we can be proactive around implicit bias. We aren't powerless when it comes to this topic or this issue or the impact that it has on our community. There are things that we can do to not only hold ourselves accountable, but to also hold those around us accountable as well. So there are a few things in the chat. So which slide do you just see right now?
We just see the title slide. Well, really, we see like the PowerPoint window title slide.
Okay, sorry about that. Let's see. Let me try and do this again. Okay, so does it say why should we understand bias? Is that what you see? And it's the whole screen? Okay, all right, thank you for that. This is what happens when I work with multiple screens, so sorry about that. Okay, there we go. Okay, so in terms of giving a definition to bias, apologies for that hiccup there for the moment. But in terms of giving a definition to understanding implicit bias in particular, these are some of the most important characteristics that I think we should take into consideration when thinking about what this means. So it's when deep-seated attitudes and stereotypes impact our actions, our decisions, and our understanding without us being conscious that it's happening. This subconscious bias can impact how we feel about people based on their race, ethnicity, and any other host of factors that make up their identity. And these implicit associations that we hold do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs or even reflect stances that we would explicitly endorse, right? So because these are things that we aren't necessarily aware are impacting our thoughts or our behavior, we may declare one thing or say one thing about our views of equity and inclusion, but we're acting in a way that is actually contrary to what we publicly profess. And then the last thing to remember is that this is something that we all possess, right? It's something that we all act upon. And implicit biases are pervasive. And so, again, even those who express commitments to impartiality and those that we are meant to trust in our society who have authority have these, deal with these. And so, you know, some responses to talking about implicit bias or some questions that some may have is that even if we have an idea in our mind or we have a stereotype in our mind, it doesn't necessarily mean that we may act upon it, right? But these ideas and these beliefs don't exist just within the walls of the brain, right, within the mind. They're reinforced within the communities that we're a part of and the society that we're a part of. So I have here just the cycle of socialization. I don't want you to worry about all of the text that's here on the screen, but it just shows that from a very, very early stage in our life that, you know, people and institutions are imprinting upon us certain messages and certain ideas. And then those ideas and messages are reinforced, right, by the individuals that we engage with, the communities that we engage with, as well as the institutions that we are a part of. And so the way that we interrupt this cycle is that we raise awareness, right, about how these ideas are a part of our existence, how they make it into our mind, how they impact our behavior. We interrupt the behavior or action by asking questions, by slowing ourselves down, by being more aware of the problem, and then also holding ourselves accountable as well as those who are around us. And so I'll expand upon that a little bit more in a moment here. So another important thing to remember about unconscious bias is that it actually is part of the way that the brain is meant to work, right? These kinds of mental shortcuts help to keep us alive. It helps to optimize our energy and our efforts so that we aren't constantly learning about new, having to learn a task over and over and over again, right? But even though there are benefits to this and there are benefits to these abilities, when it comes into decisions that we make about the people around us, right, whether it's other faculty or staff or students, there is a potential of being hurtful or harmful to members of the community. And so that's something that we have to be mindful of, right, even though there may be a natural process that's at work here. So in terms of some of the ways that implicit bias will show up for us in our lives, I'm not going to drill down on all of these, but here are some of the ways that it may show up for us, right? So there's an affinity bias. There's a preference for those that you maybe share a common experience with. If you grew up in the same hometown or went to a similar institution, or you share some type of characteristic in common with that individual, that you show a preference or a privilege for that person. Attribution. So this is assigning meaning or value to an action or a behavior. And so, you know, and what this means is that it may take just one thing for you to come to a conclusion, or one action for you to come to a conclusion about a person or about a group of people. Bias towards beauty, right? And so certain features or characteristics that a person may have. Confirmation bias, right? Wanting to be surrounded by individuals or seeking out information that confirms things that we already believe or things that we already think. Conformity, a inclination to be seen as similar or to be the same as those who are around us. Contrast, if something sticks out to you as being very different from the rest, right? So if you have something where, for example, if you're looking at a series of GPAs, right? And one GPA tends to stick out as being very, very high or very, very low, you'll tend to focus on that one particular instance. Biases around gender, right? So thinking in terms of performance, that certain genders perform higher or better than others. Halo or horns, right? So this is a tendency to think that attributing one particular characteristic to indicating a good or negative quality about someone else. Microaggressions, which I'll go into into depth a little bit more here in a moment. Negativity or positivity bias. So focusing on all of the negative things that are around you, or associating a positive characteristic with a person or a group of people. Racial biases. And then, you know, something else I think that's important to think about on our campus are biases towards student athletes, right? There are often biases that we have about how hardworking they are as students, or whether they are here based on merit, or whether they're here just on scholarships. And it can impact the way that we treat them as students in the classroom, and the way that their peers treat them as well. And so I know, Kendra, there was some information that you wanted to share about this, or perspective you wanted to share about this topic as well.
Sure. I think in working through student athlete biases, it's on both sides. I think that, you know, the information sometimes that students are offering up when they're offering it up can be challenging in terms of extending certain extensions and or deadlines, or even excused absences, especially as athletic conferences get into semifinal tournaments and things of that nature. And so we wanted to include how bias shows up, because we have heard the ongoing, I would say, challenge on both sides, the frustration of student athletes who are trying to communicate out to faculty what their needs are as early as they can, understanding that they're subject to schedules that they don't control. And then earnestly, we have heard the frustration and the concern of faculty, of students who sometimes are not communicating in advance, and two, are also putting their athletic agenda ahead of the class coursework. And so we wanted to just put that up there as an area of tension that we're seeking to manage and improve upon as we continue in these trainings.
Yeah, thanks, Kendra. So I'll just stop right there for a moment and see if there are any questions or any comments about the information so far. If there's anything that you want to add to the information that you see here, that may perhaps biases that aren't presented here on this slide. stop and see. Okay. Right. So, so I wanted to give just an overview of some of the ways that it may show up, but then look more specifically at certain forms of bias here in these next few slides. So if we think about biases in terms of performance and how this intersects with gender or with race, right? And what the research tells us about how bias may, implicit bias may be presented in these situations. So in terms of gender, there's been research about identical resumes that just have the different names. They may have a man's name on it or a woman's name on it. And 79% of those with the man's name or versus 49% of the ones with the women's name were considered worthy of hire, right? So these are identical resumes. The only thing that was different about it was the gender, the gender that was indicated by the name on the resume. And so the perception was different based on the gender that was represented there. Also, in terms of resumes with white sounding names, we know that if someone tends to have a name that is more ethnic sounding, that they are less likely to get callbacks for interviews, right? And so these are assumptions that individuals are making just based on the name that they're seeing on these resumes. Ones that I've talked about before are student evaluations of faculty of color, of LGBTQ faculty in the classroom, that there are lower perceptions of competence of these individuals or how they're evaluated at the end of the year. There's also been a research about for online courses that are taught, same course, same material, but students believe that a male faculty member is teaching it as opposed to a female faculty member. They will give the male faculty member higher ratings, right, in terms of performance. Then there's a competence and likability trade-off. So men are often perceived as successful leaders. They are attributed as having self-confidence, ambitious, competitive. Women are more likely described as communal, nurturing, and warm. And for women who assert their competence, right, and assert their confidence and their ability to do their job well, will often be seen as less likable, right, when that's a trade-off that's often not made for male faculty. So in terms of microaggressions, these are brief and commonplace daily verbal behavior or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile and derogatory or negative slights and insults. Micro insults are characterized as communications that convey rudeness, insensitivity, and demean a person's racial heritage or identity. They represent subtle snubs, frequently known to the perpetrator, but can really convey a hidden insulting message to the recipient. And then micro-validations, lastly, this is when a person's comment invalidates or undermines the experiences of a certain group of people. And so an example would be a white person telling a Black person that racism doesn't exist in today's society, right? And so in these particular examples, it communicates a message that you don't belong or that you are part of a problem population, that you're not seen as being a member of the community or the culture of an institution. And all of these things lead to individuals not feeling seen and heard and recognized. It leads to lower performance and low morale for these individuals as well. So we have a comment here from Karen. So I think we also need to consider where in the room students sit in a learning space and how we interact with them. So I think that's a good point. Karen, do you want to say more about that?
No, I was just thinking about in situ alongside of some of the more general things. It was probably more for me than anyone else.
That's okay. I mean, if you just want to expand, I think that's a good point. If you just want to expand what you're thinking about that.
Well, actually, some of our learning spaces are hard because they're very oblong rooms, and to be kind of using slides or it's just very hard to necessarily always kind of walk around the space to decentralize or where the front of the room is, and some rooms around here do it better than others. but I sometimes get chained in one place rather than, making sure that I move around the room. And I think moving around the room, you see what the students are like managing by virtue of being in the back of the room or the far side of the room in terms of what they're appreciating out of the situation. So that's all.
And Karen, I think it's so important because again, it taps also into first impression bias, nonverbal behavior bias, and then personal discomfort bias. For example, if you do see a particular demographic always sitting in the back of the room, if that is the first impression that you always see, again, as Laura Renee has shared, some of these implicit biases are shortcuts. It can create something that's not true. And I share that because I remember I had a student who was engaging in some non-verbal behavior that seemed to be aggressive. And when in fact her glasses were broken and she could not see. So she was squinting all the time. She was making weird faces and things of that nature. And it wasn't until I had a conversation that I realized it was going to be 30 days before her family could afford to get her new eyewear. So again, I think we just have to be slow to make those impressions when we can. And as you share, move around the room because it does also shift the power dynamic. And for some students, it makes us as academics feel a bit more approachable. So I wanted to just insert that in when you can.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. So I wanted to stop here and see if there were other examples, kind of like the one that Karen shared, that perhaps you've seen in practice, either in the classroom or in other interactions across campus that you think are important for members of our community to think about. So this is open for anyone to answer. So again, any examples of implicit bias that we've seen within the community here that you've had to address or you think is important for the group to be aware of? So Leah said,
I can say one.
yeah, thank you.
I don't know how many other people in the room have faced this, but I get, no matter how many times I sign my emails Dr. Kaib or present myself as Dr. Kaib, this semester it's worse than ever with students just calling me Mrs. or Ms. And I know it's not necessarily disrespectful. I think they are trying. It's a difficult one for me to navigate. And I don't know if that is exactly what you're getting at, but I don't know that would happen with male faculty as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. So assumptions about sort of what your title is, right? Or what your credentials may be, right? Even though and that's something that I've also faced as well, working in higher education, right? You'll mention someone that you work at a university and they'll say to you, oh, you have your master's. Well, I have a master's, but I also have my PhD, right? And so even though I work at an institution of higher education, the assumption is that I don't have a terminal degree, right? So that's a good example. Leah said, so implicit bias based on body shape has been increasing dramatically over the last couple of decades. Great, do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Just something to be aware of when we're in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of tracked along with the emphasis on the obesity epidemic from public health.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you look at data over the last couple of decades, you can see a pretty dramatic increase there.
I think there was a hand raised. Is it Linda?
Yeah, the two. One was in my office hours, or it could be in class, where a first comer will accede their position, their question, their ownership of my time to somebody coming in by the basis of how they look or behave. In other words, there's a difficulty of some students to own their right to time and to be there. And the other one has been commented in some of my classrooms, and it's an intersex thing where certain populations won't talk to the opposite sex, but they'll talk to all the same sex around them.
Mhm.
And it's almost as if they're an island or a wall between. It's pretty interesting. The conversations will occur like people, but not inter-group. And this could be before class or during class or after class. It's just this
Right.
interactive gelling is not as present as I'd like it to be.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, right? So who, the students in the classroom, who they feel more comfortable communicating with, right? Or who even dominates the conversation more than others, right? So you may find that there are some students who may speak a lot more, and there are others who don't speak as much, not because they don't have anything to contribute, right? But maybe it's a space where they don't feel as comfortable speaking up. Okay, so we have a few examples coming in here. So Stephen said, especially prior to COVID remote, I think some implicit bias against commuter students has been present. And then Catherine said, I think ageism is one we do not talk about as much, but it occurs both in instructor and student relationships and instructor relationships as well. So if either one of you want to say a little bit more about that, so I think, Catherine, you're talking about seniority, right?
Well, I think
Or perceptions of seniority.
sure. Yeah, if we're thinking about the instructor-instructor relationships, and sometimes I think in the instructor-student relationships, oftentimes it's even assumptions about technology competence, right? So, we'll assume, there's a younger generation of students, or they appear to be younger, and so we assume they maybe understand more about utilizing technology or familiarity, or, that they all have access to certain technology. And that also goes to, I think, socioeconomic class biases as well. I think it's all connected. But that occurs a lot. And I think, again, we do the same thing, on the opposite end as well, right? Assuming, someone of a more seasoned generation maybe does not have as much familiarity with technology or something like that. In addition to the point that you made initially, right? The point about seniority or competence based on age as well.
Thank you. Okay, so just in terms of thinking about the impact that it has on our community and the work that we're able to do together, and how successful we're able to be as an organization and as individuals, the experience of implicit bias leads to a number of outcomes. So it's loss of opportunities and promotion or mentorship, right, for members of our community. That some members of the community feel that they are held to a higher standard than others, right? And especially if there is a sense that there's more that they need to do to be seen as acceptable or included in the community. Many will have to negotiate for themselves, right, without strong supporters or mentors who have their back, who are willing to advocate for them and recommend them for opportunities. And then colleagues and students feel like that they're not fairly evaluated for their work and for their contributions. And up here, I wanted to talk a little bit about stereotype threat, which is an additional tax or a burden carried by individuals from underrepresented groups. And it's, a feeling of having to perform and having to operate, knowing that there are individuals in the community who have a lower assessment of you or a lower assessment of your abilities, right? And so it leads to decreased morale and productivity and not feeling as valued and as included within our community here. So when it comes to, some of the strategies that we have when it comes to dealing with implicit bias, and I think Samantha says here in the chat that the library just got a great book about stereotype threat, Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele. Great, thanks for that. Thanks for the recommendation. So in terms of effective strategies, what's really important for us to do is to slow down, right? To put things in place, to put processes and accountability in place that causes us to sort of slow down, to ask more questions, to be more intentional about the work that we're doing, with others, and also to be aware of our own triggers and our own assumptions. So we know that there are certain circumstances where implicit bias is more likely to show up, and it's more likely to impact the work that we're doing and decisions that we make. So if you feel uncomfortable or unfamiliar or unsafe in a situation, or you feel challenged, or your ego is threatened, we're much more likely to see implicit bias utilized in some of those situations. There you go. So Jennifer Eberhardt, she refers to this as adding friction, right? This process of slowing ourselves down. And she says we could practice adding friction to our own lives by interrogating ourselves, slowing ourselves down, just being aware when we're beginning to make stereotypic association. There is hope in the sheer act of reflection. This is where the power lies and how the process starts. So Kendra and I are going to talk about a few examples of ways that we can do this and processes that we can put in place to hold ourselves accountable. One of the first ones that I wanted to talk about, and this is an exercise I've done in a number of settings. It's called, well, I call it the spheres of influence. It's also called the circle of trust. I don't know if anyone has done this activity before, but what it does is it asks you to list your trusted 10, right? So your trusted 10 friends or colleagues, ideally not family members, but these are people that you trust the most, right? And so you would put all of those names in the left-hand column. And then the other columns on the chart would cover the different dimensions of diversity, right? And so for each one of the people that you listed as one of your trusted 10, you would go through and identify, you know, how you would indicate what their identity is, right? And how they identify across all of these different dimensions of diversity. And then you talk as a group about the different circles that we interact with on a daily basis, both in our personal and our professional lives. The majority of people, the largest circle of people that we know and interact with in our life are in this outside circle, the community. That's also the most diverse circle in our lives. This inner circle here, so the second level, these are people that you trust a little bit. You certainly trust them more than members of the community. That's about 10% of the people that you know. And then this core group is really that group of people that you trust the most, who you're closest to. And it's usually those individuals that you've listed as your trusted 10. And what's important to know about that group is that usually this is the least diverse group of people in our lives. They often share many of the same characteristics as ourselves, but this is also a group that you're most likely to go to when you need a confidant, right? Or this is a group that you're going to go to when you have a really excellent opportunity that you want to share with someone in your community. Or if you're working on a project and you want to bring in other people, or you're putting together a search committee and you want to identify who the members of that search committee are going to be, you're more likely to reach out to this inner circle core group, which is the least diverse group in your daily life. And so if we think about that in terms of the opportunities that we extend to individuals here on campus, or those stretch opportunities for advancement, or to learn new skill sets or engage in new opportunities, you know, it means that we're really not reaching out to a very broad and diverse group of people. And so in this instance, you know, we need to slow down and think about, you know, how can we stop ourselves from doing that and the choices that we're making in our day-to-day lives. So that's one exercise, and it focuses mostly on affinity bias. But that's one thing that you can do to kind of slow yourself down and to think about, who are the people I work with the most? Who are the people I'm offering opportunities to? You know, who is really my trusted group that I go to often? Accountability is incredibly important. So, and accountability at all levels, administrators, faculty, and staff. So stopping and asking yourself questions, but also being willing to do that in working with others here across campus. So, you know, one of the things that I'm really hopeful about in adding to our process and thinking about faculty diversity is that, you know, depending upon how the pool of candidates shapes up, that the provost will you know, perhaps encourage some committees to go back and to consider other candidates who may be overlooked, right? If a pool is shaping up to not be very diverse, right? So that's a level of accountability that we're building into a process to make sure that we're asking the right questions and we're making decisions based on sufficient information, right? That's available to us. So some of the things that I put here, I talk about the implicit bias checklist, which we talked about in the last session that we had. And I've also done this activity with a number of faculty committees here at Oglethorpe, and it's been a very successful exercise because it generates a lot of conversation. And I've seen a number of faculty engage in sort of stopping one another and checking one another and asking questions about the assumptions that you may be making. And so the questions that I ask, some of our search committees are what are some of the biases that tend to come up here at Oglethorpe? Right? As an institution, what are some of the biases that exist here when we think about hiring individuals, including people in our community, advancing people for certain opportunities? What does that look like here? What are biases that may arise in your own work, right? Or within the search process? And then how can you hold one another accountable to be sure that you're not acting upon these particular biases? And so being willing to speak up, discuss possible biases with your colleagues, and also being open to changing your mind, right? And realizing that maybe you need to go back to the table and make a few different decisions. And then lastly, using a rubric as a way to evaluate candidates, to evaluate students in the classroom, but using a rubric as a way to make sure that you are engaging in objective decision making. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kendra, and Kendra's going to talk a little bit more about using rubrics.
Sure, and it's a couple of things that I wanted to kind of just touch on that we weave through a bit, because obviously rubrics is one of the last things that I'll close out with. But obviously, when we're talking about how to mitigate bias in the classroom, especially going back to some of the things that were mentioned in terms of ageism, in terms of positioning in the classroom, in terms of not being addressed properly title-wise, and obviously faculty of color have an extra layer of that sometimes that is even being added to that in terms of the racial dynamic to it. But a couple of things I wanted to offer up, and these are things that most of us are already doing. So this isn't meant to be corrective. This is just meant to be a reminder of things we can do to enhance the classroom experience. So number one, pay attention to and be mindful of who you mentor. There can be a tendency and a bias that comes into play because we tend to mentor or pay attention to the people that are speaking the most in class, that may be the most charismatic, and things of that nature, forgetting that there is a difference between extroverts and introverts and how they show up in the classroom. So again, I think it's important to pay attention to who we mentor and who participates in class. But also I think it's important, and this goes into self-care a bit, which we'll deal with a bit more this spring as we look at Office of the Provost Faculty Development Initiatives. But I think it's important to structure time in between when we're making important decisions. I share that because the semester is coming to an end very soon, and many of you on the line will have to grade in a very short period of time. And again, if tiredness is attributed to that, sometimes the grading isn't as thorough, as detailed as it would be if you're well rested. So again, structuring that time in to make those important decisions are helpful because it helps to mitigate some of the implicit bias that we see show up, especially when we're looking at certain names and or races or genders or sexual orientation in terms of the students that we're grading, because there are 3 types of microaggressions. We have the verbal microaggressions, we have sometimes microaggressions that are behavioral, but then we have those environmental microaggressions. So I wanted to share that. And then lastly, leading into the importance of using rubrics in the classroom. And again, the power of rubrics is that it sets criteria in advance, and both you and the students, or in the case of job searches, the candidates can know those expectations in advance. And so when we get to the reason why rubrics, again, it allows us to take out some of the mystery and or some of the personal preference that can show up, especially in screening candidates. And so, again, as we know this, rubrics are useful in assessing deliverables. For us, we're hoping to hire the most qualified candidates. And yes, there's an emphasis on DEI in terms of their commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. There is a commitment to hiring people who have a demonstrated commitment to teaching people from a variety of diverse backgrounds. But we're also looking to hire individuals who have a commitment and a demonstration as it relates to teaching excellence. So I want to put that there at the top of the list, because we're not just trying to hire for DEI or for those who are able to show that they have a commitment to teaching diverse backgrounds. That is at the top of the list, but we are a teaching institution, right? We do research as well, and we encourage that. And so I want us to kind of be mindful of the broad stroke that we're looking at. So it is teaching excellence. It's someone who is committed to research. It is someone who has that commitment to DEI and also is committed to teaching a diverse background of students. And so the reason why rubrics become important when you're looking at all of those factors, especially when we're trying to hire candidates, some of whom could be graduate students, is that the rubrics, number one, foster transparency. Number two, they foster efficiency because we don't have to have long drawn out conversations as those rubrics are established and developed. And then the rubrics help with mitigating some of the bias that we already talked about. So thirdly, they are unbiased. Now, when we get into DEI specific rubrics in terms of hiring, these tend to be more tailored to candidates because we're looking at candidates' commitment as well as their lived experiences in academia as it relates to the subject matter at hand, diversity, equity, inclusion. Laura Renée, if you don't mind, if you'd advance the next slide. Thank you so much. And when we're looking at DEI candidate contribution rubrics, there's one largely quoted, cited, used rubric, which is from UC Berkeley, that most institutions use. Emory uses it. University of Wisconsin has their own. As Laura Renée shared, we're going to be working this spring with the committee, the DEI committee, to look at our own. For many of you who are engaging in searches this particular spring, we do encourage you, with the feedback from the Office of the Provost and with Laura Renée's input from the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, to create your own rubrics, because again, there may be some specific things that you're looking for within your division. But again, when we're looking at these general DEI candidate contribution rubrics, which are fine, and you can use these as well, they look at three things. Number one, they look at knowledge. Number two, they look at track record. And then number three, they look at plans if a candidate were to be hired. So in terms of knowledge, there is a 5-point scale, 1 being low, 5 being very high in terms of how you can rank candidates on these scales. But in terms of knowledge, a high-ranking person on the rubric would be someone who has an understanding and awareness of the unique challenges faced by underrepresented groups in academia, but they also express a personal commitment to help eliminate those barriers where they're able to do so, right? A person who'd score low on this is someone who has no knowledge at all or doesn't acknowledge that there is, in fact, a different experience, a lived experience for those and different challenges for underrepresented groups in higher ed. In terms of track record, I think the most important thing to articulate here is that track record assessment in terms of DEI candidate contributions needs to be looked at first and foremost based upon a person's career stage development. Okay, so if it is a graduate student, it may be someone who has served on panels speaking about DEI and or maybe has fostered some type of graduate level initiative related to enhancing diversity, equity, inclusion. As that person has navigated through rank based upon what was being offered at their institution, you're going to see a person who has done some groundwork in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. So if we were looking at our campus in particular, right, it would be someone who hypothetically had led or at least participated, meaning contributed to a table topic on diversity, equity, inclusion, and or inclusive pedagogy in the classroom. And then lastly, in terms of the rubric, we're looking at the plans if a candidate were to be hired. So again, hypothetically speaking, for our campus, as you are interviewing candidates, especially as you're bringing them to campus for that last round of interviews, you want to be looking for candidates who cannot just say, hey, I want to get involved in safe zone trainings, but they have an awareness of what they actually are, right? You want to look at candidates who are saying, hey, if I get hired at Oglethorpe, I always wanted to be a part of this particular national organization that is specific to DEI training. I'm wondering if there will be an opportunity for funding or for grants in order for faculty members to participate in these types of things. So again, you're not looking for someone who has lofty plans per se, or plans that are not concretized. You're looking for someone who can show a commitment to this and is well-versed in speaking the language of diversity, equity, inclusion based upon the career track. And so I wanted to pause there for a moment as well, just to see if there are any thoughts or questions or contributions to kind of how we mitigate bias in the classroom, but also the importance of rubrics.
Leah raised her hand.
Leah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Is this rubric, is this exact rubric what we're going to be asked to be used when we do hiring in the future?
No, as I shared, we're hoping in partnership with Laura Renee's office to create our own rubric for Oglethorpe. So again, this is an example of a rubric that can be used because some searches are actually going to begin happening actually in a few days, right? Starting December 1. And so there are some search committees that are asking for some examples of what they could potentially look at to create their own to get started for this round and or use this. But the long-term goal over the spring is to create our own in-house DEI candidate contribution rubric for OU.
I was just thinking that, like, it seems a little bit reductive to assume that everyone should want to work on DEI initiatives. I certainly think DEI initiatives are important, but I also don't think that that's going to be everyone's area of interest or expertise to contribute to the campus community. And obviously we have many things going on in our community and not everyone can do DEI. And so to kind of prioritize or hire people who want to work on that initiative as opposed to the 100 other things that we need to work on our campus seems a little bit, I mean, I don't know, to me it seems a little bit not quite right. I think having the knowledge and making sure that these are important, that people take these ideas seriously, I think is good, but it's the plans part for me that seems I don't know, a little bit, I'm not sure what the word is, restrictive, I guess. Sure. It feels like it closes opportunities rather than opening them.
Yeah, and let me clarify again. Oh, go ahead, Laura Renee, sorry.
Yeah, and I'll certainly let you elaborate, but I don't think you should see it as an either or kind of proposition. That there are ways to engage in work that is important for the department and for the institution and do this work as well. And I think that, in our emerging, DEI becoming an emerging priority for our institution. There are multiple ways for people who are here as well as candidates who come to campus to contribute to that. Right. And so these are some examples that Kendra has given, but whether it's through your research or through your participation in programs and initiatives that are happening on campus, the mentoring that you're doing with students, mentoring and peer support for your colleagues, and it's really expansive in the ways in which people can engage in DEI work. And so, I think we can certainly talk about other examples of and ways of doing this work, but it really is, it's a part of how we achieve our goals and our mission as an institution. And it's embedded in all of the work that we do as administrators, as faculty and staff.
No, I hear you. And I'm glad to hear that it's broader than maybe this bullet point indicated to me. But I was just thinking of like one of my students who is a person of color who expressed to me that like he doesn't really want to take a multicultural class or go into an area of research that's a DEI related. He has lots of other interests, and he feels uncomfortable when he kind of gets pigeonholed into thinking that that's going to be his interest simply because he's a person of color. And like, he's like, I feel like I have to do that stuff because I'm a person of color, but I don't really want to do that stuff because it's not my area of interest or what I want to pursue with my life. And I was just thinking about him on the job market, and would he be at a disadvantage because he didn't want to be on on a DEI task force or a mentoring program or something like that. And maybe he would be, and maybe that's what we think is important. But I was just thinking about unintended consequences, basically.
Sure, and Leah, I think it's two things. I think number one, it should have been, for example, similar to the track record, right? So please don't take that as literal. Again, these are just examples of what things could be. But I think we do have to be cognizant of our strategic plan. Diversity, equity, inclusion is a part of that. So this is going to be an expansive rollout. And given the 100 things that could potentially be going on, I think the unique opportunity that we have is to look at how DEI plays a role in all of those things as a way of helping to mitigate some of the biases that we know still are present in a variety of areas. And then to the student who doesn't want to be pigeonholed and or to different job marks, I think a lot of these things are university specific, right? So our university, obviously for the last 18 months has been very fluid, very deep, has taken a very deep dive as relates to DEI, but that's not going to be the case at all universities throughout the United States and albeit around the nation and world. So I think, again, we have to stay focused on our home base and what it is that we're seeking to accomplish here. And again, it should have been, for example, it doesn't have to be a literal, you have to be on the DEI committee, but perhaps, in the sciences, there's conversation about equity that has nothing to do, quote unquote, with diversity, right? Or conversations about inclusiveness on a campus, on a college campus. What does that look like, and how do we shape that across the board? So just wanted to add that in there.
And I think, there are ways in which, as Kendra is saying, it's institution specific, it's specific to the faculty member and the student and the relationship that they have and what they're working on. But also what we know is, our student population has changed significantly here in the last several years, and I know that that's new for Oglethorpe as an institution. But in talking with students, these are also the things that really matter to them, right? It's important that they see equity and inclusion reflected in the environment around them, that they, see issues and concerns that are important to them being reflected in the classroom and in their conversations with faculty. And so, for that particular student, I mean, maybe mentoring and supporting him in the way that he needs is significant, but it's also very meaningful for students who are coming here and students who will come here in the future. Any other questions or comments about that, or other questions regarding the rubrics or the use of a rubric? Okay.
Might there be at some point a I don't know, a rubric workshop or something to have people get together and play around with different permutations?
Absolutely.
Yes.
One of the
Sorry.
Yeah, one of the things that's okay. One of the things that we did want to offer up is an invitation for you all to share what other types of workshops would be beneficial to our campus community, especially for faculty, as we are engaging in this meaningful work. Again, we have a lot of things we could be doing, but wanting to add meaning to and value to what we're doing would be helpful. So Stephen, I'll take that as a first suggestion, a rubrics workshop.
And I wanted to just take a minute to go back to one, just the point that I made earlier on about normalizing this conversation, right? So again, you know, when these conversations happen just and they're one-off, right, and they're not followed up by anything, it can have the it can appear as if it is punitive, right, or that an assumption is being made that you're not doing this work, right? But we recognize that there are many ways that this work is happening already, right? And so this is really about just normalizing conversations about equity work and ways that we can learn from one another, and continue the conversation and be aware, right, in the way that we're going forward. So again, not making any assumptions about our faculty here and the work that you're doing, but just really wanting to further encourage your work, and be a resource and answer any questions that we can. Okay. Well, I want to be mindful of time. We're almost at time. So if there aren't any other comments or questions, again, this session is being recorded and will be available in the O Drive as well as the DEI website. And, you know, again, also very interested in knowing, you know, what other types of workshops and webinars would be helpful to you. I think once we're back to working in person in larger groups, I think, you know, being able to get into small groups and do some of this work will be really effective as well. But, you know, please let us know what will be helpful for you going forward, and we will continue offering these opportunities. Kendra, any last words?
Thank you all for joining us. This was a great turnout, especially right after the holiday weekend. We look forward to partnering with you some more. Don't hesitate to reach out to Renée or myself as we continue to do this work. So thank you all so much. Have a great rest of the day.